What you're doing, believe in it. Maybe not believe in any type of kind of larger kind of industry or field that you want to plug yourself into, but everything that's inside of you is valuable, but like distill it, work through it. Don't be greedy, but go into yourself and go into yourself with love, with confidence, with vulnerability. Do it all the way. Whether it be love or whether it be work, do it all the way and then see what happens.
I will run, I will rise, I will grow like the world's never known.
All right, we're just going to jump right in. I'm excited to introduce my conversation with Anthony. He is an artist, a poet, a teacher, a photographer, and I was so excited to be able to have this conversation. I came across this stuff and I was moved by his conversation around love and around the work that he does and operating out of choosing to operate out of love. And I don't know, I was through our conversation, there's a lot of things that we really connect on. And I think one of the things that stood out the most to me, there were so many times that he'd be explaining something and I'd be like, it would really resonate with me. So he's definitely someone that I feel like is on the same wavelength as me, and just honestly, just such a good, kind human. And I love connecting with other artists and to really kind of get to know them. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. Here is my conversation with Anthony.
It's awesome to get this opportunity to chat with you. I've only recently kind of come across your stuff, and your work's really incredible. And so that's like one half, and then the other half is I've just watched a lot of the content you've been putting out, and it's like the message that you have that's really just struck me. And so I'm excited to get in and chat. And before we get into it, I'm interested to like go back to like childhood. Like, what was your upbringing like?
Mhm.
Kind of talk me through like your origin story, if you will.
Yeah. Wow. I don't think that far back in that way sometimes. In terms of like trying to connect the proverbial dots. But I was I was born in Chicago, and I guess it sounds like this is going to take forever, but it actually doesn't. My parents were evangelists, and so I was born in Chicago. That's kind of really the only credibility I have. And then after a year, we moved, and because they kind of moved around, um, my father was from New Orleans, so we ended up moving back to New Orleans. Eventually, found myself in Beaumont. My mother and my father, they dropped out of school together, college, and like I think they were both sophomores, and so we spent most of our time in Texas. They got divorced though, and then we ended up moving to Houston, and all of that was really important. One, my family was very religious, and then things changed, of course, after my parents were divorced. And I think it was really important because even though I am not religious now, that still creates, belief systems create these parameters in a sense that you are always kind of working against or within. And so it was really important as I grew up, I just remember kind of always dealing with Christianity, with my belief system, with things that I thought. It even, impacted my, some of my cultural sensibilities as well, things I did, things I didn't do. So being coming from a religious household is always important to my origin story. I think that there was always this undercurrent, or at least I always remember this being this undercurrent of creativity. My At least my mother's side, they were all musicians, and interestingly enough, my mother's side is from Kansas City, but we did spend time in New Orleans and in Louisiana, and so the connection between like jazz is really weird. jazz in terms of New Orleans, but jazz also, this kind of like Mississippi River vein of jazz in a sense may have just run through my family from like, the relationship between the Mississippi. I'm thinking about like Amari Baraka's, he has a book called Blues People. And now I'm kind of like thinking about that in relation to my family, where he talks about the Mississippi River basically being, the reason or the way that jazz actually found its way into North, the northern part of America. And so yeah, jazz is really important. I think that was kind of like a conduit into creativity. And so all of us kind of like my brothers, and even my mother, are kind of, I guess, creative thinkers in a sense, and hardcore, like kind of like type B personalities. And so yeah, so that was kind of my upbringing. And I was kind of an overachiever, like early on, and then that kind of fizzled out a little bit. But I always had an interest. I thought I was going to be a poet, but I
Interesting.
think poverty was really played a big part in that as well, because there comes a certain anxiety sometimes that can cut both ways. And it's really interesting when we do talk about certain things as if they're reasons that people are the way that they are. Because, for me, I run into a lot of people that are like kind of raised in poverty that have totally had like these ambitions to be rich and, and to overcome poverty, and make as much money as they possibly can. And many people you see that are, affluent sometimes come from that story. I know Oprah Winfrey comes from a story similar to that, or at least involving poverty, and a lot of people have. Whereas my mother, I remember I had a conversation with her, a pivotal conversation in seventh grade, where I had taken the aptitude test in middle school, and I asked her, I said, "Look, I'm thinking about writing. I'm gonna be this writer." And this aptitude test said, you know, I could be a teacher or I could be a writer. And she was like, "Well, you should be a teacher because that way you will eat." I would never forget that conversation, because that conversation was so important. It was also so riddled with what I know now is my mother's anxiety. And so that was
So
interesting. So
one second before I'm really interested. So at seventh grade, you already identified that you liked writing. Like, at what point? What's your earliest recollection of going like, oh, one, I like this, and two, I can be this.
yeah, well, I had been writing poetry for like a while, and I think in seventh grade I began writing poetry, but we had also kind of like continued to move, and so I started writing poetry when I believe the first time I started writing I wrote a poem. It was like on the floor of like my mother's friend's house that we were living with at the time in Deer Park, or in Pasadena, Texas, or whatever, which is outside of Houston, which is really important because that also there's a pall of racism that goes on in Pasadena, and I know that there's the Ku Klux Klan is pretty active in that area, and so I remember being in that area, and so I remember racism. I remember this kid that I knew that was a sharp at the time, which is skinheads against racial prejudice, which always seemed like an oxymoron to me. Um, but and then poetry, So in many ways, it's kind of relevant to the moment, I think, and relevant to some of the things I think about. But so I just we had that conversation, and looking back, I wish my mother would have been like, "Damn it, become this writer," but I understood why she didn't either. And so I did choose to be I went to school to be a teacher, but during undergrad I wrote a lot of poetry, and I've somehow found my way into, as saccharine as it is, into visual poetry, so
No,
and
this
to
is important.
photography.
what you're saying, I think, is really important. These moments when you're younger that impact you, that you knew inside you that writing was just enlivened you, right? It's just part
Mhm.
of you'd already been doing it at that point.
Right.
And then it's this connection of like you sensing this thing inside you, but then when that rubs up against, you're talking to your mom, and
Yeah.
because of her experience, she was like, well, you know you, it wasn't like don't do it, but it sounded
Mhm.
like she was like,
Yeah.
well, but this one we'll make sure you eat, because that's
Yeah.
part of her story, right? So like,
For sure.
but it was still in you, and you couldn't
Yeah.
hide from it. Like, as much as you're like, okay, I'm
Yeah.
gonna go
No,
this
never.
way, it's still there. That's
For
very
sure,
interesting.
and I think it always will be, and for everybody, I think it always will be, and we're just in a different moment too, like where, like we talk about like the economy. I just had a conversation with a relative of mine, a young guy, you know about that same thing, like being able to eat, and thinking about industry rather than what it is that you would like to make or contribute to the world, And so a lot of times you're like, well, how do I plug myself into stability, And
Mm.
that's still important. But then at the same time, I forget who this guy was, but I was listening to somebody and they were saying like, the facade, I mean, like stability, especially within certain industries, well, just in the idea of industry, of having a job that is affiliated with a corporation or an entity, besides yourself, suggests that that big corporation will give you some level of stability. And I've seen it with my mother. I see my mother was laid off ultimately, rather than kind of going gently into retirement, and so that is also kind of like a lie, it's
Yeah.
not really real. So working for yourself, one, um, can have stability that people don't see, like unforeseen stability, but then at the same time, um, the stability that we think is there is not necessarily. Things can change and corporations cut and the job market changes quickly these days. So yeah, so it's just it was like that. But ultimately, I became a teacher. I taught. My wife is in the military. I always have to say this because it's really important, because people kind of, you know, many artists, many creative people will run into people that are able to flex, in terms of like be flexible and move into certain things. And really, like my wife is a beautiful, smart person, and she knew what she wanted to do early on, which I always think is really important with that conversation that I had with my mother. Um,
Right.
she had a similar conversation with her mother, but her mother was totally whispering to her since the age 5 that she was going to be a doctor, and my wife became a doctor. And so she was just really steady, whereas I was just kind of like trying to fit myself into places that may not necessarily work. And so I think that that really affected me. But my wife, but because of her support, I was able to kind of like try things on. So I ended up getting a master's in educational leadership, and then I also have an MFA. And so now I teach on a collegiate level. But then I'm a full-time lecturer, which gives me enough money considering what our combined household is. Because I just think that if your audience sees this, it's always important, especially for younger people, to understand that you know things aren't necessarily as clear as they seem, especially when it comes to art, because our society loves art. We consume art. We need art to live. But then at the same time, we don't understand that either it costs something or it takes great cost,
Mm.
to make happen. And so, um, so that's really important. And so that's part of my story. Is my partner's story is part of mine. And so right now I stand as a college educator, but I also, have a studio and make work and put work in museums from time to time and do talks and stuff like that. And a lot of my work has to do with like love and compassion. And that comes from what I feel I was given by my mother. So that's my origin story, I suppose.
So how That's very interesting. So how did you get to actually, before we get to that, I want to go back because I feel like you're like that conversation that you had with your mom and saying, I think I want to go here. And
Yeah.
then her saying, well, that's cool, but be
Yeah.
practical. And
Mhm.
I think two things that I wanted to mention, because like I think this kind of happened, a very similar thing happened with me. But first off, I think what happened with uh, that generation was, I think that the marketing and the story around get a degree and get a steady job and you're going to be safe
Yeah.
was something that was more tangible,
Mhm.
back then.
Yeah.
And as like to your point, it's the story of it made sense, but now with so many people having higher education
Mhm.
and nothing stays the same, right? So it
Mhm.
was true probably for that moment, but what they don't realize is that that moment is shifting. and
Mhm.
and even though it was steady at the time, it won't be when your seventh grader is going to be getting out of college.
Exactly.
The atmosphere is going to completely shift, and it might not be the same thing then, but it's
For
all that
sure.
they knew, right? Because my
Mhm.
dad had a similar kind of verbiage that he was saying is, for him it was always going to be an engineer, like get a technical
Mhm.
degree,
Yeah.
because
Exactly.
he
Yeah.
didn't get a
Mhm.
technical degree. He followed his passion and did I don't, man, I'm blanking on what he did, but
Yeah.
it was recreation. He got a
Mhm.
master's in recreation, and
Yeah.
he was working several jobs and trying to support a family. And his
Yeah.
brothers were engineers, and his dad was an
Yeah.
engineer. And so he's like, he's just trying to seeing the world that he viewed, and was like, hey, if you
Exactly.
get a technical one, I see my brothers being
Yeah.
successful, and so that's what you should
For
do.
sure.
I wanted to be a designer. And I
Yeah.
grew up knowing that that was like an artist was in me,
Yeah.
but I also had my own path of like, um, wanting to. I made the decision that I thought the technical degree would support a family,
Yeah.
and but it was still like, to your point, like that poetry was in you, like that part hasn't gone away, and I have a day job, but I
Yeah.
also am like growing this
Yeah.
other stuff on the side. So
For
it's
sure.
very similar, because like I saw that narrative, right, of education and playing it safe.
Yeah.
And now as we're getting into the workforce, you're realizing that there's not as much stability and safety as there was at the time
Yeah.
that the council was given. And I think
Yeah.
that's an
For
important
sure.
thing to bring up, is that it's a generational
Yeah.
shift, and it'll continue to happen. I always think about that. I know that you have kids, and I always think about
Mhm.
how can I do things that are more timeless, that when I'm giving them,
Yeah.
it's not just a fad, but allows them to figure out the situation that they're in when they're in their 20s, right? When they're in
Yeah.
their 30s, 40s, like it's going to progress. And me saying do this now won't may not be the case in
Yeah.
2 decades when they're
Exactly.
looking for jobs. So I have as a parent, I have a hard time realizing that I came from that, how to
Yeah.
give proper advice that will help them in a world that I know nothing about, right?
Yeah.
In 15 years, what is that going to look like? I don't
Mhm.
know. And
Yeah.
so I don't know. I struggle with that, because I
Mhm.
think from that same thing, I wasn't true to who I was younger, and I'm
Mhm.
realizing that I've lost some of that, and I'm recorrecting now. But
Yeah.
yeah, anyways, I just wanted to
Yeah.
like highlight on that, because I
That
think it's important.
that's true. It's interesting though too, because even some of the creatives that I know don't necessarily kind of function in the rare way that I function, which is in a space where we're talking about like art and the art industry, the art world versus kind of like the creative world. And they overlap for sure. But, you know, it's something interesting about, like, say, for instance, if you're a designer and somebody's saying, could you design, say, like a campaign for me, in any way, and all of the things that accompany a campaign, versus somebody saying, or me putting something, say, on a museum wall, and somebody saying, you know, that they do or they don't want to buy it, right? Like that type of kind of thing is interesting. Especially there also is kind of upfront money that a lot of people don't think about, like that you need either residency or you need the money to make artwork and
Mm.
how consuming that is. And then also it can be very slow. Like you can, not make it until you're 60 or not make it at all while you're alive. And so it's really interesting. And so I'm really going through a transitional period. I just turned 40 and I'm just really thinking about the next 20 years in a sense, especially considering the fact that I still have credentials. I have credentials that would put me in another field altogether. And so I've just really been thinking about that. And It's really interesting. So we're in a lot of very similar places, actually, you and I. So hopefully we'll talk, a lot more about these things, and maybe we can kind of work together to kind of
Yeah,
give each other
absolutely.
insight. But yeah, man. So that's kind of, I mean, that's not exactly where I am right now. I mean, it's a really interesting time, but yeah.
So how did you make that jump from poetry and teacher to photography? Like, what was the inroad into
Man,
that?
this is so weird because it's like, you know, I've thought about this stuff, and it seems to be like these pivotal moments, And so there was a pivotal moment. I was teaching. So when I first got out of undergrad, I started teaching high school English. That was always the plan, really, because that was my mother's, suggestion. And so I got in there, and at first it was kind of funny too, because I hadn't had it
Sorry,
that
how
much responsibility.
how how old were you at the time when you got into
Man,
that?
it took forever. I was a first generation college student. My parents went to college, but they dropped out. So I think I got out like when I was like 25. And things were always weird, man. Like when you think about, we're in this moment where we talk about like opportunity, when we talk about like who gets opportunities and who doesn't. Man, I very like as I was about to get out of school, I met my now wife, and she was like about to finish grad school, and I was like, "Yo, um, like who the fuck am I, man? Like I'm talking to like this woman that's always had her shit together, and I'm like 25, about to get out of undergrad. And she's like 25, about or you know, I think she's a little older than me, but she was like um about to finish med school. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on? Like, like this is silly. Like, and what are you doing with your life? Like, stop it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, don't mess with me. I don't know where I'll be in the next few years, And so but it was interesting. There was a lot of kind of give and take. My wife was a military. My mother always told me not to go to the military. And if you know anything about the military, a military spouse is essentially in the military, in terms of like where we go, what we do, or whatever. And so we had this conversation. She was like, I'm in the Navy. I was like, what? Like, what is the deal? And by that time, I was like a person that I don't always have my life, mapped out, but there are certain kind of predispositions that we have very early on. Obviously, like these conversations that we're having is all about these predispositions and like our upbringing.
Yeah,
And so I was always kind of like a romantic, and I was like, I'm like marry somebody around this time where I'm finishing and shit like that. And so we were in it. Like once we met, we had like this conversation about like where we wanted to be in a year, and we had both gotten out of it. So it was like, man, it was like we weren't as good as married, but it was a little bit intense, because it was almost like an arranged marriage in our minds. It was kind of like if everything works
right.
out, like we'll be married soon. And sure enough, we were. And so, off I was into like Jacksonville, North Carolina, um, on a Marine base of all kind of like military branches. And, there are a lot of jokes between military branches. And so like of all places on a military, on a Marine base, Camp Lejeune, I found myself, and it was a culture shock, but I taught there, which was also interesting. I taught there. I never forget. I taught there during, the first like Obama election, and so like I got a chance to learn about all of the politics there, and like our youth from within that culture, and so that was interesting. And so I finished school, and I was looking for a job, and I ended up going to grad school. My partner supporting me, and then I ended up there was still kind of like nothing to do, and so I went and got my MFA. Now the thing was, long story long. I'm sorry about that, but so there was I felt like I had fulfilled everything my mother wanted me to do. I had even finished the master's at that point, in education administration, because I didn't want to be in the classroom anymore. um, so I think it's just the particular classroom. I didn't want to teach high school English anymore. But I sat down and I thought about it, man. I was like, I want to go to art school. What am I going to art school for? Am I going to continue this poetry thing? Or I had picked up a camera and I started making photographs. Even before my wife, I had an ex-girlfriend that had started like this thing with photography, and so I thought about it. I had a camera, and then my wife bought me a camera early on, and so I had started shooting, making work. But I always knew I didn't want to do. I think what happens is, right, like it's the way that you do things, like the nature of things, that kind of sometimes speaks to the lane in which you find yourself. And so a camera is just a camera, and
Yeah.
there's a guy, Alan Sakula, that talks about like photography and commerce, and so I had thought about, ever since I picked up a camera, I wanted to do with the camera what I was doing with words. And so
Mm.
I wasn't interested in making photographs for weddings. I wasn't interested in retail photography. I was interested in like, you know, what emotion, what expression you know, not capture, but create, with a camera. And so I was always kind of conceptually driven. And so that pushed me. And then of course going to grad school just furthered that pursuit. And before I knew it, really didn't have any experience, honestly, like, either way, like as a photographer or as an educator. But I had gone to school. I was afforded the opportunity to go to school. And so, I oftentimes think about like that as kind of having startup money. I mean, we even see that with school. Like some people can't, they can't go to school, or they can't get startup money, or and so those things were kind of my opportunities to kind of get into it. And so that was the thought. The thought was, am I going to do poetry or am I going to do photography? And it's funny now, I still feel like I still think about poetry. I'm writing a little bit more than I used to now. And I'm thinking about it. I'm like, man, what were you thinking? Like, if you're a writer too, man, there's so much damn overhead with photography. I'm just like, man, all you would have needed was like pens and paper. You know what I mean? Like that's it. But you wanted to go into photography, man. It's so much overhead. Like I've spent so much money throughout the years. It's just ridiculous. Like you've got to have a business, or at least lie to yourself about having a business in photography. Like in order to justify it, man. It's just crazy. And people see stuff, or people see like your grip, you know what I'm saying? Like the stuff that you have, and they're like, oh man, you got a lot of equipment, man. And I'm like, yeah, I got a lot of equipment, man. This is like ridiculous. Like, what am I doing? And so yeah, so it was a pivotal moment where I asked myself where I was going. And so I ended up, I ended up doing photo, man. And I'm happy with it. I think I communicate pretty well. I think I express myself through it pretty well. But yeah, I mean, poetry is still a very beautiful thing, and words are still very beautiful and important to even the work that I do now. Reading. So, and that's where I am.
Oh, it's very fascinating to hear this side, because I've just come, at an angle and just come into your work now and not
Mhm.
knowing the backstory. But now when you talk about the poetry, it totally makes sense when I see your work, because that's like the one thing that I would say when I came across it was emotion. Like
Mhm.
absolutely, like when you look at your stuff, even in just like I don't know, it's very moving. It seems so effortless and simple, and that's when you see that, as another artist, like that's when like, wow, there's a lot that
Mhm.
went in
Yeah.
to get to this point. And a lot of people who don't create. I've been on this like thing because I work in a big company, and I
Mhm.
recognize the people that run it that aren't creative, that aren't, they just do
Yeah.
what they're told,
Yeah.
versus the developers and designers and creators, that there's a mind shift when you see something and you take action to do it
Mhm.
versus get people to do things.
Yeah.
And the mindset of a creator, there's so much appreciation when you look at the world, right? When
Mhm.
I look at other people's work, it's I like other people's success is their success, and it's
Mhm.
outside of them. Succeeding doesn't mean I'm failing. It
Yeah.
means they're succeeding, right? And so like
Yeah.
I think there's this. I grew up and I did track and field, and I loved it because there's this camaraderie, and I feel like that's what the
Mhm.
art community is to me. It's I have a respect for other people doing their work because it's unique to them, right?
Yeah.
And to see them hit that success, I understand because I've tried to get my ideas out of my head to convey to someone else. And so when you try and do that over time, you recognize when someone gets there, you go, wow, like
Yeah.
I can appreciate that and keep going with mine. And it
Yeah.
inspires me. Like, and that's why I started with my stuff is, I think one of the things that I struggle with, one of the areas that I think that I see a lot of similarity between you and I is, um, just multifaceted creative. Like,
Mhm.
you grew up with this idea of like writing and having this strength, and then coming into a camera and going, okay, how do I convert this form of medium into
Mhm.
this medium?
Yeah.
Right. Like it's very interesting because I do a ton of stuff. I do photography, video. I do an
Yeah.
annual magazine.
Mhm.
So I don't do one thing, and I can't.
Yeah.
I've recognized that, especially in a big company, everyone tries to give you one title, and
Yeah.
it doesn't work for me. I do so many things. I think there's a book called Range. I don't know if you've read it, but it
Mhm.
talks about being a generalist in a specialist world, and how
Mhm.
the generalist that can do multiple things, how they're the connectors, right? They're
Mhm.
the ones that essentially, creativity is just being able to connect two different things that don't seem that they'd
Yeah.
connect. And it's those generalists that can apply information from a completely different field into this one. And I think that that's one of the things that is your strength too, is,
Mhm.
when you come across something, because you have a diverse background, you're able to, to make connections that someone else wouldn't be able to. And I think that there's
Yeah.
a lot to be said. I've spent a lot of my time pushing that away and feeling inadequate,
Yeah.
because I just need to do the one thing that can help me get money or be successful, or
Yeah.
that's what society tells me. But it's also like, um, what helps me to be the happiest, like to be me, to get this thing, this creativity that's around me and directed through me out.
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
and that's hard. Like, to your point, I absolutely know what you're talking about. Like, you have to have a business, or convince yourself that, like,
Yeah.
fool yourself that you have a business to be able, because I know
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
I I know exactly what you mean by that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
completely makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
difficult. How do you manage that? Like, how do you
Man,
navigate that?
I think I think every once in a while we're kind of overwhelmed by the need to reassess. And I think that we're always reassessing, but sometimes reassessment looks kind of like we're juggling. And whereas I think a real strong reassessment has to kind of be in the moment where time seems to stop, and the transition is actually um, taken seriously. And so I think for me, I think this year has been one large kind of moment of disequilibrium, and I think the thing that affected me is I just have a problem because I think the reason that I make work, and I hate. I'm not gonna say I hate labels, right? Because we need to communicate. So in a sense, of communication is about kind of description in a sense, right? So of course, like labels are inevitably failed set of jargon. You know what I mean? Like that's just it's just what they are. But then at the same time, we can always build on them. And so I I've just had a problem with um so I don't want to say I'm a radical, right? Like I'm not a radical. And I think anybody that kind of thinks that sometimes they're not trying to say that they're radical. They're actually just saying that I'm what you think of as a radical rather than being like, whatever. So my point is that I think, and maybe I'm not even a radical, maybe I'm just a fucking romantic, man. I think what happens is I think that seventh grader that sat down and started writing poetry, I think that I'm at a point where I want to be that person. And I think what I realize is that everything short of that is just an inevitable compromise, or a seemingly inevitable compromise. And I understand that. I understand, like my mother says, we need to eat and we need to make sense of all of that stuff. I understand it. We need to, put food on the table, especially if we have children. But I also feel like one of the things I'm realizing is that, and this happens in the creative community a lot. We say, "Oh man, I've never worked a day in my life," and it's like, no, that's not true, and stop that bullshit, because once you tell somebody that it costs to do what you do, like that is where like things change, right? Like, I mean, I know you can kind of feel me. I was negotiating with a group, an entity that I really dig, I liked, and they approached me and they were like, "Yo, we want you to do some work for us." I was like, "All right, cool. Well, here's my day rate." And then all of a sudden, I was holding my damn breath the last 24 hours because I gave them my day rate, and I'm scared that they're not gonna meet my day rate, right? And so, and then they come back and they're like, "Okay, this is what we want, cool." And I'll tell, it's these small moments too. Like it's weird as you get older too. Like money doesn't even phase you, even though like it sometimes is a lot of money. And I'm like, oh, I told my wife, I was like, I just made some money, I guess. They're cool with the day rate, and it was just kind of like, it was like, yay, and you know, so it's interesting because I don't, basically to your point, I don't think I want to really be. I never wanted to be in the art world. Like you would dream about it, right? Like, oh, well, this shit would be dope if like, my work is up here or I did this residency. But I realize honestly, and this is kind of an American culture thing, is that if you don't want it all in the way that people say that you want it all, then somehow you're a dilettante, or it's a hobby, or it's lesser. When I think that it's so much a privilege if you can dig into something so deeply and at the same time not necessarily have to make money off of it. And honestly, sitting here with you, it's just been so beautiful because I was just thinking, when we're interested in things like love and community and gathering, um, and just us being together is the reason for us being together. We don't have a lot of opportunities to do that. We don't have a lot of opportunities to get to know somebody. Shit, even when I'm out making photographs and I'm just on a walk, sometimes it feels like I don't even have the time to stop and talk to people, which is like, why, like, that doesn't even make sense. Like, how is it
Yeah.
that I don't have time when I'm making time, And so for me, I'm in this transitional period where I'm actually thinking about leveraging education that I have in order to make more money than I'm making right now as like this artist, and and just go and do this day job and just to some degree like take the fetters off of my artwork. And um because there have been people, man, like that, just like I remember this one story that I read about this artist that's well known, but basically this he was a painter and he was late in his life and ended up getting this one residency, and he was able to make this work, And maybe he had started to, his trajectory started picking up, but then he died, and so it's just kind of like, it's kind of weird. It's almost as if like one capitalistic system needs to like overcome another one, which is totally a conversation for somebody that has,
Mm.
opportunity, which is what I've had. To be like, I don't want to play this game anymore. Like, I'm gonna go play the other game just so that I can keep this game clean, and that's kind of where I am right now. And so it's funny to talk to you in this moment because I'm really in this transitional period where I'm thinking, you know, I'm a portraitist. I work with people, and usually people aren't available to the weekend. Well, shit, if I can work a 9 to 5 and then make work with people on the weekend, then I still have my practice, my art practice. But then at the same time, you know, I'm not playing this game in the art world. In the art world, it's almost having enough money to like tell somebody to leave you alone, but you're still like, the only way that you can do that is to kind of like get into this other kind of game. And so that's kind of where I am. So you're just saving one thing for another. And I know that's kind of like what is the idiom, right? Robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? Like that's exactly what it is. And so shit turns out like in capitalism, you gotta rob somebody, you know what I mean? Like that's just kind of what
It's so funny that you talk about this because I remember I started my YouTube channel um, a year ago, and in June of last year of 2019, and by this time, I think it's a year ago now, I did my first video where I said I'm a fake on the internet, and I
Yeah.
basically for so long I've everywhere you look, I talk about, being, running like a multimedia company where I do photos, videos, and create
Mhm.
content around learning to live life intentionally. But
Yeah.
I've never said anything about the day job that I have that
Yeah.
allows me to be able
Hmm.
to do that. It's exactly what you're talking about. And
Yeah.
I felt like exposed for the first time.
Hmm.
And I've realized in coming into this and talking with more people, it's exactly what you're saying is every artist that's doing that thing, there's a very few amount of people that
Hmm.
actually are only an artist. Like
Yeah.
and none of them that I know, but I know that
Yeah.
there's some that's
Yeah.
they've gotten to a point where they're able to do that. But and this is why I started like this podcast. It's all about decisions. Like even when you look at
Hmm.
your wife,
Yeah.
it's the decisions that all these little decisions that led up to them doing that.
Yeah.
And decisions are the power that we have as
Yeah.
individuals
For sure.
to change our future. And
Yeah.
and that's the whole podcast is around talking to people about decisions they've made and they're going to make.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's the bookend. And I think for me, kind of to your point, I always look at it like this because I look at you talk about startups and they're getting investment money to be
Hmm.
able to try a thing. They have a
Yeah.
hypothesis. They convince
Yeah.
people to give them the money to try it out. And I've essentially, when I started doing my work, I was saying, okay, this is now my day job is my VC, and it
Yeah.
allows me to not have to worry. And when I come home, I have my kids, and then I have time after that to
Yeah.
be able to do my work.
Yeah.
And my whole mentality has been in 20 years, I think I'll start to get it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm approaching it this way with like a long-term mindset,
Mm.
it changes completely the way that you look at, kind of
Yeah.
getting money. I'm just about to put out a video on I run an annual magazine. I haven't sold that
Hmm.
many, but I did it in a way where that every magazine I make, it's, 445 profit
Yeah.
that I make. So I don't keep any inventory. So I talk about this. I talk about,
Yeah.
hey, it's not a lot right now, but these things are leading me to my
Yeah.
next project, and I don't
Yeah.
have to worry about money because I have my day job. And I
Yeah.
don't think enough people are talking about that. Is
Yeah.
that to your point? Is like I'm a romantic as well, and so I'm definitely like the starving artist. But
Yeah.
you to your point, I have kids, I have responsibilities, so I cannot starve. That money has to come from somewhere. If I'm not
That's
gonna,
right.
if I'm not gonna use my art to get the money yet, if I'm not in the point where I'm trying to monetize from that, I
Yeah.
have to monetize somewhere, some
Yeah.
skill that I have to
Exactly.
compensate. So I think this
Yeah.
is a conversation that many people have all the time, and it's always readjusting, right? Because you'll get in. My brother-in-law had the same thing. He did photography, wedding photography for a long time, and that was his bread and butter. And
Yeah.
he got burnt out. He just decided he didn't like it, and
Yeah.
so there was this moment where he was like, he was a history teacher, a high school
Hmm.
history teacher, and was able to make the transition into being full-time photographer, but it was doing weddings, and he's like, this
Yeah.
isn't what I wanted anymore. And so he was in the same boat that like you and I were
Yeah.
in, where it's like, I need to switch. Maybe it's a whole new career, maybe it's not. And
Yeah.
he's doing politics now. He's like, my love is
Yeah.
politics. And so
Yeah.
he did the same thing. Like the weddings were like a big bulk, and then he's had to shift over again. And it's a
Yeah.
constant evolution
Hmm.
of you as an individual. Of,
Yeah.
two things are going to happen. You need to do your art, and you need to get the money. And maybe at some point they do overlap, and maybe at some points they don't.
Yeah.
And that's the art of life, right? Is
Exactly.
how do you get both out? And I don't think it's an easy answer
Yeah.
for
I
anybody.
mean, yeah. I mean, for me, I think, I mean, there is self-expression, and there's something interesting about the need to do that, and also I think it's interesting too, and I think some of my art philosophy is really kind of starts to affect that thinking as well, because then I start talking about how, like, when we do talk about creatives, when we talk about like even decisions, right, we're talking about art in many respects, and we're parsing up like what exactly it means to kind of make art or to be a creative. um because I mean, shit, like even around home and like working and doing these different things, you find that there's so many different ways to do things. And so when we talk about something being a art, well, you know, even what is it? Foucault, right, talks about, Michel Foucault goes into talking about the subjectivity of science itself, right? The fact that there's a lot of leeway in science. There's a way of doing it, but then there's also, it's fallible, let's put it that way. And so, I think it's a good moment. I think whenever, one of the things I've learned is that this equilibrium is always kind of a good thing, that, if you're aware, if you're sensitive to it. So that that discomfort that we're aware of, that conscious discomfort, there's something that can always come out of it, and that's really the process of learning. So that's our brain and our emotions kind of coming together to, create something new. Um, so yeah, I mean, so it's a good moment. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a good moment all around in so many different ways, especially like right now. I'm always thinking about politics. I think about politics in a different way, not just, governmental, but I'm thinking about like, love is politics. I'm thinking about power. And so these relationships. And so it's really important to me. So
I think that's actually a good transition, because I know we're kind of getting, I think we're a little bit over.
yeah, but
Um,
we're good.
I did want to shift back over to kind of closing on some of the stuff you were talking about at the beginning of,
Mhm.
how I came across you was just your messages of love, love as power, and this
Mhm.
idea that um, you're not falling in or out of love. You have
Mhm.
love for people. I thought was
Yeah.
just a really a powerful thing for me, just personally, because I'm going through separating, from my someone I was married to for over a decade,
Mhm.
um, and it's this weird thing that's happening that, to your point, is like we've been saying, like, we came into that relationship with love and we're leaving with love,
Mhm.
and we still have, we have 3 kids, and so we're navigating. It's looking, it needs to look different, but I still
Mhm.
have ultimate love for her, and she, in turn for me,
Yeah.
even though the relationship has to change, we still have
Yeah.
kids. I want her to be successful. She's, a ceramic artist, and has
Mhm.
been
Mhm.
working to get her stuff off
Yeah.
the ground. And then So that idea of love matches more my definition, because
Yeah.
there wasn't a start and stop. It was just like I love this person even though it's not right. We both kind of like had conversations and said like this isn't the right moment for us,
Yeah.
and we need to make those decisions.
Yeah.
But it didn't change the fact that I love and respect her,
Yeah.
and I have no negative emotion towards her. And it was a weird moment because you hear about, how we're taught to love, and it's
Yeah.
always just it always is conditional. It really
Yeah.
is. And
Yeah.
so your message of it being just what it is, you have love for someone. um I just thought really, really, really struck a chord with me, and it made sense to how that definition
Yeah.
means for me. And so I wanted to talk about that, and then also
Yeah.
about, like, we were talking about community and bringing together, and
Yeah.
what you're doing with this next project.
Dope. Yeah. Man, when people say stuff, I mean, I think that that's why I make, right? But I wasn't always sure about, like, I thought what making is, right? But we don't know what we're making. And I'm realizing that more as an artist, right? What we're
Mm,
making is kind of community, right? And because the thing is that the things that we create, people interact with them. And I've really been big on this too, is like culture and symbols. And so the fact of the matter is that, like, symbols are not what they seem to be, right? And when I say seem, they aren't what they appear to be, is probably a better way of really kind of semantically tackling that, right? Like, they aren't what they appear to be because they look a certain way, but on the way that we interact with certain symbols, um, change what the symbols are, And so, um, I think that for me, like, within art, right? Like, within, especially in the academic sense of really thinking about art and thinking about concepts and digging deeply into them. Usually, the way that the art world functions now is that somebody has an idea, and that idea is the form in the, it kind of creates the parameters for form, right? And I don't mean to get too, like, too theoretical, but the point is that people start to say that work is about something year after year, but that work either evolves, or they're asking themselves questions, but they're not really asking themselves questions that may, in a scientific sense, be wrong or right or whatever, right? And in a sense, that's probably impossible in art. But I haven't wanted to do that. I wanted to kind of ask myself questions about love, about autonomy, about expression, about representation, and the ultimate question for me is whether or not I'm loving, right?
mm,
Care is the action of love, and I'm asking myself, well, am I caring when I make this work? Am I building community? Is this love? Is this an action of love? And that's where, kind of like, I mean, I talk about capitalism, but it's really important to talk about capitalism in this part of talking about love, because we're talking about benefits. How does somebody benefit from this and that and so on? Especially when we talk about, like, in the art world, where something has to, either we're cutting even or we're making a profit, and so is that at the
right.
forefront of, like, whatever exchange it is that's happening in my studio, right? Like, um shit, and then we got a lot of reasons to go against that. Like, some people, their mantra is, if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. And so, like, there's nothing being done if there's not a monetary exchange or a monetary benefit from it. So a while ago, I just started thinking about love. I was thinking about feminism, and I was thinking about, like, namely Black feminists. Brought me into bell hooks, and I was an English major in undergrad, and of course I went to art school. So there's a lot of theory that's always been a part of my work, and a lot of that comes from my seventh grade self being interested in poetry and all of these theories and stuff like that. So it's been a real big part of who I've always been. And so I was interested in love. I'm interested in not just love, but, like, love in action. Love is praxis. Love is care, right? Taking care of people. And so that's really kind of one of the things that's impacted, like, the work that I make, and, like, what
Mm,
me being so jaded with, like, how I've been doing things. You talk about, like, your own personal world of thinking about things. Like, that's kind of how I felt. It's like, am I doing what I say I'm doing? And so what in a nutshell, what I want to do, or what I continue to try to do, is to show love. There are formal things that we can talk about, but the way that I construct an image, the way that I make an image, what happens in the studio, what continues to happen outside of the studio regarding my work, I want that to be an act of care, and love. I don't like, in bell hooks, I can talk about bell hooks a lot. I'm reading another bell hooks book, aside from everything else that I've read. And I just want to, and she says that, we're in control of love. And that's really important, when we talk about politics, like even governmental politics, because as humans, right, and we find this at this moment, as humans, we are in control of, at the end of the day, if we, depending on how conscious we are still responsible for how we act and how we function. So, and she talks about this, right? Sometimes we think that it's okay to have a chip on your shoulder and be mad at people because of things that have been done with you. I want to be careful, because I know that this argument that I'm making right now can be used, in America anyway, where we have this polarized way of thinking about politics, can be used on the left or the right. But her point is that there are people that are hurt, there are people that come from different walks of life that have always been loved. And then sometimes we think that that gives you the right to be hurt, and to exact that hurt upon other people because you have been hurt, right? And we can see that when we talk about this generally, because of the way that America is set up, is specifically on both sides, we find that they're justified, right? Like, oh, well, this was wrong. This was done to you. So now, like, you can vote this way. Oh, you were treated like shit on this side. So you can vote this way. Or you can treat people that, get that money. If you never had money, like, get it. That can be your MO. But one of the things that I believe is that I have power. I have power to love. And if I can understand what love is based off the relationships that I'm in, then that means that, like, I can not just enter into a practice, because that's kind of the terminology that I've started to use, is like, love is, if love is a practice, then you enter a practice with different people. And that also helps us when we start talking about, like, sexuality, right? Like, not necessarily based on sexuality, but based off of religions, and I mean relationships, in a sense, right? Like, I have a different practice with, say, my homeboy than I do with my wife. It's a different practice. It doesn't change love. It changes the practice of love, the care, the way that we exact care upon people, or enter into this relationship of care. And also, like, love can't exist if it's unrecognized, in a sense, which is really interesting too, right? Like, it's like, if I send you love and that's not love to you, because I'm not speaking love in the way that is understandable to you, in a sense, then we have to continue to have this negotiation of you receiving love, right? Like, and then when you receive love and I receive love, then we are in a practice of love, in a sense, right? So it's way more, like, I won't say way more cerebral than we think it is, right? But it's really willing to do the work, right? Because it's really not about, oh, like, that's deep, right? But it's really about, like, how much am I willing? And I think about this stuff, and I was sitting down and I was thinking about, like, how, like what you're saying, right? How relationships end. And sometimes relationships end out of, you have self-love, you love yourself, and you also are in a practice with another person. Well, sometimes the love that you have for yourself, in a sense, and what you need for yourself, can take you out of another relationship with another person. And or change that relationship, which is another thing that I love, right? So one of the things that you're saying is that your practice is changing.
Mm.
The love is not changing, right? The practice is changing. And that is beautiful and painful and all of these things. But ultimately, the older I get, the more I'm like, damn, man, like, love is a beautiful thing. And in this COVID era too, like, even, like, just love is a beautiful thing, or hapticality, right? Our ability to touch each other, in whichever way we do, is just really important. And so, you say you admire me, man. Like, I'm just working through these things, and I give myself a platform to kind of talk about love. But when it is kind of corroborated by somebody else's experience, then it just means that like we, even though we haven't chilled and hung out with each other, we enter into a community where we are kind of like speaking the same language. And anybody that's going into any place where somebody's speaking the same language to them, you know, it's a beautiful moment, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of where we are. And so my work is on that, and that's what I'm trying to do. And but then I just realized that in order to continue to stay in that lane, perhaps, you know, you always have to ask, I think we have to ask ourselves serious questions about like why we do what we do. And you know, and what you want from whatever it is that you're doing. And so for me, I think I find myself in transition often, but specifically right now because I'm actually thinking like I think you used the term 20 years ahead. That's exactly what I'm thinking about, right? Like I'm thinking about like in
Yep.
20 years at 40, like 20 years, you know, if I'm still like, what do I want from what it is that I've been doing? And the thing that being an artist has allowed me is like I know how to share work, and I think that that's what people want. People want exhibition, right? They want
Mm.
exhibition. They don't exactly. A friend of mine, Chad Dawson, he talks about this like in his dissertation, even like what is exhibition? Well, exhibition could be, hey, Mark, I want to show you something, right? Just two people sharing work is exhibition in a sense. And yeah, maybe it'd be nice if you were a curator and you were like, yo, let's put this shit up, you know? And I'm like, yeah, let's put it
Yeah.
up. But at the same time, how do you want, what do you want exhibition to do for you? Like, what do you want that exposure to be? Do you want it to be for your friends? Do you want the world to see this work? And then sometimes you have to, you know, sacrifice. The last thing that I'll say on that that's really interesting that you were talking about, just from us sharing, is that one of the things that I've found is that when you want to do things on a grand scale, depending on how you're doing it, at times the very form of what it is that you want to do can change based off of your goals with it. And so like
Mm.
one of the examples I use is I learned about recently, and maybe I'm late, I learned about like what influencers are, right? Like I learned about like people that come in, say for instance, because I love photography. Well, I don't know, that's a dangerous thing to say, but like it may be wrong actually. But my relationship with photography and expression seems to be like you said, like romantic. But I've learned that people that have these platforms that are putting themselves out as being a specific thing, say on the internet, are not doing content that is directly related to them expressing themselves, but more so connected to like the industry of something, which is not the same as doing the thing. So I find that I'm somewhere, just to kind of literarily and narratively bring us back to the center. I find myself somewhere between um, the dreams that I really never had, but of celebrity, being celebrity and wanting these big grand ideas that I don't think were ever authentic, and doing what my mother wanted me to do, which was never for me either. And so I find myself stretched in a sense, right? Like
Mm.
how do I provide for myself, but then at the same keep my work? So the last thing is I'm thinking kind of like you do, like what do you tell your kids? I find out I'm kind of in a weird place. Like I find out that I have found that like some of these things that we think can only be interpreted one way are like the possibilities are endless. They really are. And so the thing was this idea of doing what you love. And so I'm at a crossroads. I find that we think doing what you love means getting paid enough to only do that thing. When I find that 24 hours a day, I don't think anybody is doing merely what it is that they say they love. It's impossible. So my thing is yes, do what you love. Do what you love. And not only that, but I would even go as so far to say that you cannot exist happily without doing what you love. But I don't think that you wholly need to subsist off of what it is that you love. And quite
Yeah.
frankly, trying to subsist off of what you love may completely dismember what it is that you say is your practice of doing what it is that you love. So that is what I've kind of found myself at this point. I'm sorry for how long and stuff like that it is, but so that's what I'm thinking. Like, yeah, you got to do what you love, but I don't know that doing what you love needs to like earn you a living. And maybe it's safer if you don't, or safer if it doesn't.
Man, yeah. There was like so many things inside
Sorry.
of that. Like no, I'm there's so much that I connect with you on this. Like what you're saying, I think, and I think this is like the hard truth of living. Like this, it's not just about even just like artists. Like these are the truths about, even someone who's just like a worker or an engineer or someone who wants to be at a company, whoever you are, like, these are the constant struggles that you have. I just read this book called Burnout, and it talks about the feeling cycle, and a lot of times you get burned out when you don't finish the cycle of the emotion that you have. And one of the things that they talked about was the importance of, a lot of times, kind of what you're talking about, is we have this idea that our objective is to always be happy. And the whole premise of the book is to explain that the objective isn't to always be doing that thing you love or to be happy, but it's to understand and to correctly and a health wise operate between the flow between doing what you love and doing what you need.
Yes.
Is kind of like what they talk about. It's exactly what you're kind of saying, is that the happiness doesn't lie in the end result of doing what you love. It's the flow between the two. And it's how you go between the two that allows you to manage it in a way to sustain it, right? Otherwise, you're going to be in a place where you're not meeting your expectations, or on the other end, you're burnt out from doing so many things. And so I think that it's the quality of life is inside of the flow between responsibility and expression, and how you navigate that. And it does come, like, let's be honest, it does come down to money. Like you do have to be able to pay your bills. There's a quote from Seth Godin. I forget what book. I think it was Poke the Box. But he talks about oh man, I just blanked on it. It was
that makes
right
me feel
there.
good, because I blank on things all the time. So I'm just like, kindred spirit,
Man, dang, I was going somewhere with it. I totally lost it, so I just have to end it.
That's cool. But no, you were I know you're gonna remember it. So when you remember it, just go ahead and just interrupt me. But I'm just thinking, I've got some friends, and I'm accumulating all these friends that are kind of romantics in this very moment. And I think and maybe that's what like a lot of artists do. They end up kind of like, they end up making work about their particular moment. And so I got a friend, and he's talking a lot about like kind of like social practice art, or building communities and so on. And he was, I forget how he put it. I'm about to like badly quote something or forget it too. But he was just like, the reason, and I think I said it earlier because this is kind of how I paraphrased it, but trying to create something to where people are coming together because they want to be together. And I believe that unfortunately we're at this moment, like this late stage capitalism has put us in this moment where these very kind of simple human ideas seem so radical and so far-fetched too. I remember somebody was like, oh, we don't go to parks anymore, we go to like shopping centers, which was also kind of like a critique of capitalism or whatever. and shit like that is just so true. I mean, we are lucky enough to have a park in our neighborhood, but that's because of, you know, opportunity, and so it's really interesting. Although some people do pay to just live on top of a shopping mall too, which is interesting. Um, so it's fascinating. So that's kind of where I am. And I don't know if that kind
So,
of puts you in a good place, but
well, I have a question for you about this, about community, because it's something I've been thinking about recently. So I like what you're saying about, like, this ability to come together and to unite,
mhm,
and to recognize, just like, to me, like, the biggest thing is just, we are all just people. Like, I'm just
mhm,
a person. Bill Gates is just a person,
yeah,
right? Like, Elon
for
Musk
sure,
is just like you and me, just a
yeah,
person. And we get in this mode where we celebritize people in a
mhm,
way that we think that they're above humans.
yeah,
And it's not anything that I think we're subjectively trying to do, but it's that we think that their worth on a society as a whole is more
yeah,
than individuals. And the point that I'm trying to get at is that a lot of times what I see happening is, I don't know if you've seen the social dilemma, um,
mhm.
where,
No, I
where it
haven't seen
talks
it
about
yet.
how it talks about how AI is,
Mhm,
big tech companies are using it to only show us our own biases. and
mhm,
and and it's one of the things that I've recognized in watching it, is that everyone thinks that it's bad because it's only showing us the things that we want to see. So, like, if you're a Trump supporter, you're only going to see the things that
yeah,
support your thinking,
yeah,
right? Or if you're a Biden supporter, you're only going to see the things that support that.
yeah,
To me, so there's this, and that is community, right? Like, it feels good to be
mhm,
around people,
yeah,
but there's also this, like, this need. What I see with the time that we're in, kind of what you're talking about, is this need to not only be comfortable being around
mhm,
people that think like you and feel like you, but giving yourself the openness, and directly going outside of that community
mhm,
to to con to connect and commune with other people that aren't traditionally, the AI would not
yeah,
have brought to you, but
for
that you're
sure.
like, you need to be exposed to. We need to be stretched. And so that's where I'm
Yeah.
trying to, from your perspective, how do you balance the, wanting to have a community, but then also being exposed to different thinking,
Yeah.
so you don't get only closed minded to that one community?
Wow, man. That's the first thing the only thing I can think about, I can't refer to anything regarding that question, besides thinking about my partner. Um, because we had a really hard time our first 3 years of marriage. Um, and there becomes this part of us all the time where we don't want to, um there are these fights, right? We don't want to give up. We can't concede anything. We don't know why we can't concede these things. Um, we we can't be pushed, which is another thing too, right? You talk about stretched, but sometimes we can't be pushed. We're immovable
Mm.
objects. Um, and so I just remember that. But one of the things that I appreciate is that, like, through that relationship, I've, become a little bit more assertive. I'm still kind of like who I am. Um, but there's been so much exchange, and that's not to say that, like, hardship hadn't happened in that relationship, in our relationship, because it has. But my point is that, like, relationships, they build and they can also change. And I think um that we have to understand the form of good, right? But not, maybe not good, right? We've got these terms to talk about, like, what is good and what is bad and so on. A lot of times I think about, like, sweets, right? Like the fact that, like, even even oranges, if I were to eat several oranges without brushing my teeth, can still give me enough sugar to where they could just kind of, like, did my teeth deteriorate. Um, And so what we start to understand is that, like, kind of what you're saying, right? Like, even within our lives where we need kind of like, the things that make us happy, the things that challenge us, even what is it, like Malcolm Gladwell, where he talks about, like, I think, well, I can't say that it's just Malcolm Gladwell. In his writing, he refers to, I forget who the theorist is that talks about flow state, right? And then
Mm,
Malcolm Gladwell kind of talks about it. But the whole idea of kind of like being in a flow is that you have to have a certain level of rigor and challenge
hmm
in order to get to this place of proficiency, right? But if you can't do something well, then you can't necessarily flow within it. And doing something well only comes through facing this equilibrium. And so it's really important us to understand that even in love, right? We have to understand what love is. We have to understand the language in order to care for somebody. You have to understand the care that they need. I mean, like, even with doctors, you can't go in and be like, oh, this person has, this person has a symptom and I'm going to treat it this one way. No, you have to understand everything that is going on with that particular biological environment, right? That a person kind of deals with in order to treat them well, understand their history and all of these things, which really strikes me that I said that because, like, I think about like relationships and I think about people, and that's what we're talking about at this very moment, right? We're talking about people's history and understanding them. So how do you treat people considering how they've been
Wow.
predisposed to certain things, right? And so um, I think we have to understand what relationships are. We find ourselves, we have to want to do the work of relationships. And I don't think that we pay attention to what relationships are. Some of our best friends, we've had some of the worst fallouts with. And some of the people that we think are our best friends because of the good relationship that we have with them are probably not that great because they haven't been challenged,
Mm,
And so I think that relationships have to be challenged. And I'm not saying that I'm the best at that. I've got friends that it's still hard for me to tell them that the shit that they're doing is like messed up or whatever. But I can say that a friendship in which that type of information can kind of flow, oh man, like I would take that any day over like the eggshells friend. You know what I mean? Like the
yeah.
person that I got to tiptoe around. And even my relationship with my partner has also changed, and this idea of romance has changed because you start realizing that people are people, and there has to be a lot more actual direct communication with people than we thought. And that goes back to that idea of kind of like what you understand me to have talked about, which is kind of this falling in, falling out of love. Because falling in and falling out of love suggests that there are all of these things that we don't have to be conscious about. And we do. We have to be conscious about these things. We have to be
Mm,
deliberate about these things. And so I think with our relationships, we have to. I think it can be dangerous sometimes to seek out people that you're different from, thinking that you're going to build this relationship with that person because there has to be a will for somebody to be in a relationship. But you know, I don't know you, Mark, and we've come together based off of kind of like what we create, and so when you start to get in these relationships, it depends on kind of like your will and also your openness to kind of learn, and also the all of these weird emotions, right, that we avoid. So maybe we don't avoid shame, maybe we don't avoid guilt, maybe we
mm,
don't avoid being wrong. Those things are really important, and that's what we try to get away from. And there's some things that, quite honestly, science says that we tend to kind of function in, which is kind of like doubling down when we're wrong. We tend to be defensive. So we have to be vulnerable, which is really
yeah.
interesting in a society where like machismo and strength and manliness is really important, because you find that people are so defensive because they don't want to be vulnerable, because it's a different type of pain. Like, for some reason, physical pain is so much easier to endure than some of this psychological and emotional pain that is also out there, and also just continuing to threaten our lives. But if we can go through that, and that's why some of us, that are certain ages, 40 and under, are really different creatures in a sense, right? Because we do some of that, but then maybe we don't like some of the physical pain, but we can definitely deal with some of this emotional and psychological pain, and we're just waiting to get it
Yeah.
out sometimes. So my father is a different type of weak than I am. You know what I mean? Like, but maybe he's a different type of strong too. So those things are important. So I think seeking out those things, and being open to people, and like you said, understanding that we are human. Um, and I know I've talked a long time, but I did want to say one thing that I thought was important is, you know, I think that we get into these conversations and we talk about what our abilities are, or we don't talk about abilities. We talk about things that have been affected. And I just think that, I talk about love and I talk about care, but I also feel like we just have these abilities to endure, and we always have the responsibility to react no matter what. And it seems like it's this unrecognized responsibility, because it's a responsibility that we all take up. But at the same time, the way that I treat you, regardless of what has happened to me, um is still a moment. Like, you talk about this, a moment to decide. Unfortunately, like, we have to have, not unfortunately, but we have to have our own standards, in a sense, no matter kind of where we are, where we find ourselves. Um, because I'm still I think maybe what some people like about me, and some people might even take issue with me, is that I still find that I know that we're strong enough to make decisions on how we treat each other. And sometimes we don't necessarily, we're not aware, or maybe, um
I I think to your point, a lot of times my big thing that I keep saying, that like the track that I'm on around live life intentionally is like one of the big phrases that I use, and the other thing is, and around this podcast I say it a lot too, is that we need to challenge our assumptions to create better, well-rounded beliefs. And I think this
mhm,
is the part that I don't think it's that people maybe are intentionally not wanting to be vulnerable, but I think that we haven't challenged their assumptions. And so like you and me
mhm,
for a long time, until my end of my 20s, is when I really started to challenge some of the things that I had been told from my dad, from my mom.
yeah,
And it's not a bad thing. I'm not like, challenging isn't a negative
yeah,
thing, but I think
yeah,
this to me is like the core of when you look. And I think when people say things, and I think how could they have that viewpoint. I think part of it is that people are still operating under a uh, what they were taught when they were a kid,
mhm,
and they
yeah,
haven't, because it's a lot of times it's authority, right? It's like our
mhm,
kids
sure,
listen to parents and then to teachers, and then you get out, when you're in your mid 20s, to be on your own, and then you have a manager, and it's like everything is about following
mhm,
the hierarchy,
yeah,
and we don't put a lot of emphasis on discovering who you are. And I loved what you talked about, uncovering that seventh grader that you are.
mhm,
So much of how I live, it's in between these two things of trying to understand and uncover who I was when I was in seventh
yeah,
grade, right? That 12
yeah,
year
yeah,
old, 13, and who I want to be in the next 20
yeah,
years, like where I'm
yeah,
going. And so I kind of live on these two separate ends. But I think, to your point, the big thing to me, the important role in anyone's life is to challenge their assumptions,
mhm, for
and
sure,
don't be afraid to challenge it, because that
yeah,
is what's going to uncover your biases, your belief system, and it'll allow you openness to say, well, do I still believe this? Is it still something that is creating the outcome that is helpful for me and the people around me?
yeah,
That challenge, I think, is necessary in each one of us to transition from child minded to adulthood. And I don't
yeah,
think everyone gets there because they don't
mhm,
recognize the need to grow
yeah.
mentally in that realm.
Yeah, and I think even our, like, sometimes even our tools, Audre Lorde talks about, like, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And I think even our way of kind of dealing with our way of kind of our tools at times are inadequate for ultimately where we want to be. Like, say for instance, you know, a lot of people like to say, oh, we're all the same. No, actually we aren't all the same. And so now what? You know what I'm saying? Like, now what? You know, we aren't all the same, so now how is that? I mean, it's even interesting, like how we kind of think about like you know, like nationalism in a sense, right? Like we're all America. And we're like, well, what does that mean? That just means that we're
Yeah.
all here. You know what I mean? Like, so does that, like, that could also be promising, because if you're saying that's because, you know, we're all here, then that means we got to deal with it. You know, I mean, maybe that's what it is, but it's, you know, we all are different. And what we
Yeah.
have to realize is we have to understand each other's languages, which is another thing that people don't want to leave out of. I oftentimes think that imagination is a beautiful thing in terms of thinking about um, love. I believe, like, even well, I'm working on this idea actually philosophically. Imagination versus empathy, right? Because the problem with
Mm.
empathy is that empathy does not make you move, right? Empathy suggests I care about this because I too have a child. So that child reminds me of my child. What would I want not to happen to my child in order for me to change how I am? But imagination suggests, like, how do I move to that space and then how do I function? Irrespective of who my child is, or irrespective of what my lot in life is. And so we have to be willing to move ourselves. How do you move yourself and then care? How do you move yourself?
Mm.
How do you, you know, um, and so that's really important. It's just, you know, and that's kind of where I find myself. Do you care no matter what? You know, do you just care? Um, because we do find ourselves in this situation where empathy can be the reason you care is because this person is close to you, which continues to breed some of the same kind of like sexist, classist, you know, racist ideas. So that becomes problematic. Whereas we need to move our perspectives and move our vantage because we are so comfortable a lot of times, you know, so
Well, I think one of the things that I would add with the empathy, though, that I think is really important, and how it differentiates from sympathy, is that it's about the other person. So
mhm,
it's not about like me caring because I have a child and I don't want that to happen. It's saying this person lost a child or whatever happened
mhm,
between
yeah,
there. It's not about what I need to feel. It's
mhm,
understanding what they're needing to feel. And so in that same
exactly.
regard, needing knowing that we need to move, it's also the
Yeah,
empathy of understanding why they're not moving. And I think that
yeah,
is a really key part of empathy that is that is really makes it a powerful tool, is that it's not
mhm,
about me, it's about the other person always.
yeah, for
and
sure.
and I think that sorry, I know that we've been talking. I have a sense that I could probably talk to you for 5 hours straight. I'm someone
Yeah,
who
I
could
know.
just chat.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
I wanna kind of close this. I'm sure we'll continue to have. I would love
yeah,
to have
for
continued
sure.
conversation with you.
Mhm,
Your mind is just someone is something that really hits a note with me that makes me think critically, and that's what I look for in people. Is just
mhm,
I'm always wanting. I don't think I'm right. I'm just
yeah,
looking for other opportunities to discover new things, and
yeah,
I've really enjoyed talking with you. The last thing that I would love
likewise.
to hear from you is, I always ask this question. I'm always fascinated by it. But what would you have told 18-year-old you? What's the advice you had? Just a moment to sit down with 18-year-old you in a room and have a dialogue. What would that kind of counsel be?
Um, 18. Oh man. I think that I would I would probably say I would give myself a reason to work hard. And I think that that has to be reassurance. Like, yo, like, you know, what you're doing, believe in it, you know, and maybe not believe in any type of kind of larger kind of industry or field that you want to plug yourself into, but everything that's inside of you is valuable, but like distill it, work through it. I do think that like 18-year-old me, like going into college, this is important, right? Like don't be greedy, but go into yourself and go into yourself with love, with confidence, with vulnerability. And just don't like, you know, one of these things I say is like, do it all the way. Do it all the way.
Mm.
Like all the way, all the way. Those three words, right? All the way. Whether it be love or whether it be work, do it all the way and then see what happens. And I think that that's what I would say to myself.
Oh, I think that's powerful. I think that's really good. Is there anything else that you want to, say in closing, or anything that we missed
Yeah.
that you wanted to touch on?
Man, I appreciate you having me here. I think a big part of my practice, I didn't know it when I was in graduate school, but I always said that like as an artist, I wanted to talk about my work. Um, and so that I can contextualize my work. The thing is, I had no idea that my work itself would be like love, care, community, and in the simplest form, right? So, you didn't pay me to be here. You didn't, you just asked me to have a conversation with you. And it's been edifying. It's been beautiful. And I think that, that I don't know. I mean, I think that I appreciate you having me here, but I think for everybody that's kind of thinking about, how do you build community? How do you love more? How do you do work? One of the things that I learned from a person that I admire was that for every creative, the work, if we could just imagine this, the work is not the product. It is it is the love, it's the care, it's the community, in the most simplest ways possible that unabashedly retain and edify our humanity. That is the work. And so I've learned to start to detach myself from the physical production of things and just what
Mm.
is the interaction that led to the production of those things. And so those things are kind of shells. There's just artifacts of something that happened. They're documents, and so I appreciate you having me here so that I can kind of exercise that thing. And so, if we could all just remember that the work is more spiritual, in a secular way, but spiritual nonetheless. The work is that, the work is that which we can't see.
Yeah. Dang, that's really powerful. Thank you
Yeah,
so much for
yeah,
taking the
man.
time. It was awesome. I really enjoyed our conversation, and there's so many other places that I'm fascinated by you that I wanted to like dig into, and so I would love to kind of keep the
Yeah,
conversation going.
anytime, man. Anytime.
Yeah,
Like I appreciate it, and thanks for having me, man. And hopefully we'll get up soon. And I guess hi and bye to everybody that watches.